Megan had always felt safe in her own home. Until tonight. The night had started like any other. She had gone to bed after a long day, but everything changed when Peter, her teenage nephew, appeared in the doorway. She thought she had locked the door, but something didn't feel right. Megan lay stretched out on her bed, the cool sheets clinging to her bare skin. It had been a long and exhausting day, and she could finally rest in the peaceful solitude of her home. The sun had set, leaving a warm glow through the window. She exhaled slowly, letting herself relax, but the creak of nearby floorboards made her sit up. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked toward the doorway. Peter, her teenage nephew, was standing there, his figure dimly lit by the hallway light. "Peter," she said, her voice soft but laced with curiosity. "What are you doing up?" He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to the side before quickly returning to hers. "I couldn't sleep. I was just getting some water." Megan furrowed her brows. "It's late. You should be asleep," she said gently, trying to brush it off. But Peter didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer, slow and deliberate. Megan's heart began to thud in her chest. His gaze didn't waver, and she instinctively tightened the blanket around her shoulders. "Peter," she repeated, her voice cautious now, "what are you doing?" "I thought I heard something," Peter mumbled, his tone hesitant. "Did you forget to lock the door?" Megan's stomach tightened. "I'm sure I locked it earlier," she replied quickly, trying to shake off the uneasiness. "It's fine, just go back to bed." But Peter didn't answer. He kept moving closer, his steps slow and measured. Megan's breathing grew shallow, her eyes darting between him and the doorway. "Peter." Her voice was a warning now. "What are you doing?" He stopped at the edge of her bed, his clear eyes fixed on her for a moment too long. Megan shifted slightly, uncomfortable under his gaze, and then it happened. His eyes dropped briefly, unmistakably, to her legs. A chill ran down Megan's spine as the realization hit her. He had seen her, her bare skin, her exposed thighs. He had caught sight of her and was now standing there, watching. Her heart pounded harder. Her breath hitched in her throat. "Peter," she snapped, her voice rising in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Peter's eyes darted away, his face flushing. "I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, Megan's voice hardened. "Get out," she commanded, pointing toward the door. "Go to your room now." Peter's face went pale, and without another word, he turned and fled the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Megan sat there in stunned silence, shaking. What just happened? Megan remained seated at the edge of her bed, still trembling. Her heart was racing, and the silence in the room felt suffocating. She glanced toward the door, half expecting Peter to return, but the house remained eerily quiet. Her mind replayed the moment over and over. Peter's presence, his gaze, and that brief, uncomfortable slip. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something she couldn't ignore. As she rubbed her temples, trying to clear her mind, a sudden knock on the door startled her. "Aunt Megan," came Peter's muffled voice from the other side. Megan's eyes widened. A wave of confusion and tension washed over her. "What do you want?" she asked cautiously. I'm sorry," Peter mumbled. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for it to happen like that." Megan's jaw tightened, her fingers clenching into fists. "Go to bed, Peter. I need some time alone." There was a pause on the other side of the door. Then Peter whispered, "Please just let me in for a minute. I need to talk." Megan hesitated. Something about his voice, something desperate, made her uneasy. But against her better judgment, she sighed and unlocked the door. It creaked open slowly, and Peter stepped inside. He didn't meet her gaze immediately. Instead, his eyes darted to the floor. His posture was stiff, almost awkward. Peter began, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know. I didn't mean for things to get weird. I'm sorry." Megan frowned. "Weird?" Her tone was sharp. "You think this is just weird?" Peter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to. I wasn't thinking." Megan took a step forward. "What were you thinking?" she asked coldly. "Coming into my room in the middle of the night and looking at me like that?" "I wasn't looking on purpose." Peter interrupted quickly, his face flushed. He looked genuinely troubled. "It just happened. Megan scoffed, crossing her arms. It just happened? Peter, you saw me. You saw me half-dressed like it didn't mean anything to you. Peter's eyes finally lifted to Megan's, and for the first time, she saw something beyond guilt in his expression, something darker. An attention she couldn't quite name flickered across his face. I didn't mean to, but it's hard to forget, Peter muttered, almost to himself. Megan's breath caught in her throat. What did you just say? Her voice was barely a whisper, barely audible. Peter hesitated, his jaw tightening. It's hard to forget what I saw. The air between them grew heavier, dense with unspoken thoughts, lingering guilt, and something far more unsettling. Megan could feel it building, something wrong, something dangerous. You need to leave. Now, she finally said, her voice sharp and firm. Go back to your room, Peter. We'll forget this ever happened. Peter's gaze dropped again. I can't. Megan's eyes narrowed. What did you say? I can't stop thinking about it, Peter whispered almost to himself. About you. The air between them grew heavier still, thick with unspoken thoughts and rising tension. Megan's heart pounded, a mix of fear and anger. Stop it. Just stop, Megan said, turning away, pacing toward the window with her fists clenched at her sides, trying to shake off the suffocating feeling of vulnerability. This isn't right. None of this should have happened. Peter followed her, his footsteps soft but deliberate. I don't know why I feel this way, he admitted, his voice quieter now but still intense. But I do, and it's not something I can just forget. Megan spun around, her eyes flashing with frustration and confusion. You're my nephew. This isn't normal. This isn't something we can just brush aside. Peter's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. It didn't start like this. It wasn't supposed to happen. Megan's heart was pounding harder now, the situation spiraling into something darker, something she couldn't control. What do you want from me? She whispered, her voice breaking. Peter took a step closer, his gaze intense, searching. I don't know. I feel something, Megan, and it won't go away. Megan's breathing quickened, her mind racing to push away the mounting fear. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. This was dangerous. You need help, she said firmly, stepping back. You need to talk to someone. Peter cut her off, his voice rising slightly. I don't need help. I just need you to understand. I need you to see it for what it is. Megan's eyes widened in shock. What it is? You're my nephew. This is twisted. You don't get to decide this. It's wrong. Peter's face contorted, his jaw clenching even tighter. It feels real to me. I didn't ask for it to be this way. I feel something. Megan's voice trembled with anger. You need to stop this right now. This isn't a game. Peter's eyes locked onto hers, something dangerous in them, something primal she couldn't ignore. I can't. You can't, Megan repeated, her hands trembling at her sides. She felt like she was losing control. You have to stop. Peter stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. I'm sorry, but I don't know if I can. Megan's chest tightened, and she stepped back instinctively, bumping into the edge of her bed. Her pulse throbbed violently as she felt trapped, exposed, not just physically but mentally. Get out, she whispered. Get out before I... But before she could finish, Peter's voice cut through the tension. We're connected now. There's no going back. The room spun around Megan. Her breathing became ragged, panic bubbling beneath the surface. She had to get away. She had to stop this from going any further. You're my nephew, she snapped, shaking her head in disbelief. You can't mean what you're saying. Peter's gaze softened, but it didn't waver. I do. And I don't know what to do with it anymore. Megan felt a wave of desperation wash over her, each word from Peter pulling her deeper into a place she never wanted to go. The threat wasn't just to their relationship. It was to something deeper, something she could never erase. And then, from the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement. Peter was standing in the doorway again, his expression unreadable, but this time, there was something calculated in his gaze, something deeply unsettling. I shouldn't have come in here, Peter muttered, breaking the silence. Megan looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. No, you shouldn't have. You shouldn't have said what you did. You shouldn't have. I didn't want it to happen like this, Peter said quickly, cutting her off. I'm sorry, I can't control it. Megan's fists clenched tightly in her lap. This isn't something you just can't control, Peter. This is wrong. Peter's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. It didn't feel wrong at first. It felt right. You made me feel something I've never felt before. Megan recoiled, her stomach twisting in disgust. That's not an excuse. You're my family, my nephew. I know how it looks, Peter said softly, his voice almost a whisper. But I can't help how I feel. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Megan's breathing quickened, a mixture of fury and fear bubbling inside her. We can't do this. We can't keep pretending this isn't happening. Peter took a step closer, his gaze locked onto hers. But we can't pretend it isn't there either. Megan stood abruptly, her eyes flashing. We have to pretend. You need to walk away from this, forget what you think you feel. Peter's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. It's not that easy. Megan's heart pounded harder. It has to be that easy. I won't let this ruin everything. I won't. Peter's expression darkened further, his voice lowering. You can't stop it, not now. Megan's fists clenched tighter. I'm your aunt. I raised you. How could you let this happen? Peter's eyes glimmered with something dangerous, something Megan hadn't seen before. It wasn't just me. It was you too. Megan staggered back, her body trembling. The words hit her like a blow, tearing through every defense she had. I didn't mean for this to go this far. Peter's voice trailed off, but the damage was already done. The tension between Megan and Peter hung heavily in the air, suffocating every sound and movement. Megan paced back and forth, her mind racing to make sense of what had just been said, what had just happened. Her breaths were shallow, and her heart pounded violently in her chest. How had things spiraled this far out of control? How had she let him get this close? Peter, on the other hand, stood silently, watching her with quiet intensity, every movement under his unwavering gaze. His expression was unreadable, but Megan could see the internal struggle behind his eyes, as if he knew deep down that what they had done could never be undone. Finally, she stopped in her tracks, spinning to face him. Her voice came out cold, sharp. You can't keep doing this, Peter. You can't. Peter's gaze didn't waver, though his jaw tightened. It's not something I can just turn off, Megan. Her eyes narrowed. This isn't something you should feel. This isn't right. This is wrong. I know, Peter said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But it doesn't change how I feel. Megan's chest tightened as tears pricked the corners of her eyes. This isn't something that should exist between us. You're my family. I raised you. How can you let yourself feel this way? Peter's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. I didn't plan for it to happen, but it did. And now I can't ignore it. You don't have to keep feeling this way. Megan's voice rose slightly, desperation and anger mixing. You need to walk away from this before it destroys both of us. Peter stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers. I can't just walk away. Not from you. Megan staggered back, the room spinning slightly as her mind fought to comprehend his words. You have to. You must. I won't let you ruin everything. Our family, our lives. This isn't just about feelings anymore, Peter. This is dangerous. Peter's eyes softened momentarily, but there was vulnerability in his expression, one that gave Megan pause. You're scared. I get that. I didn't mean for this to happen, but now that it's out, we can't pretend it didn't. No, Megan said firmly, shaking her head. We must pretend. We have to. Peter's gaze hardened once again. It's too late. I can't pretend it didn't happen. Every time I see you, every time we're alone together, I feel it. I feel something between us, and it's not going away. Megan felt her body go rigid, a wave of cold fear washing over her. You're my nephew. This can't keep going. Peter's voice lowered, his tone dark and quiet. It can't stop now. I've already crossed a line I can't erase. Megan's chest heaved as the words sank in, each one heavier than the last. Her breathing became erratic, her mind screaming for a way out. But there was none. She couldn't escape what had already begun, and she knew deep down that Peter wouldn't stop. He couldn't. Not now. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension, thick like a suffocating fog, between Megan and Peter. It was terrifying, but what scared me the most was how easy it was to ignore the guilt when I was with him. There was a moment, a fleeting instant, that would haunt me forever. It was late one night, and I found myself alone in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup. The silence in the house was stifling, and I hadn't realized how much I missed the chaos of everyday life until it disappeared. I hadn't realized how lonely I felt until I saw him again. I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me and turned just in time to see him standing in the doorway. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said softly, almost hesitantly. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave, to go back to his room, but another part, the one that was so tired of pretending, didn't want him to go. "You're not interrupting," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He stepped into the kitchen, closing the space between us with his presence. "I've been thinking about you," he said gently. His eyes locked on mine. I felt my breath catch in my throat. How could I still want this? How could he look at me like that, knowing everything at stake? But in his eyes I saw something that made me forget everything else. The weight of the world seemed to lift, and in that moment it was just the two of us. Then, without warning, he stepped closer. I should have pulled away, I should have stopped him, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. Before I could stop myself, I reached out, brushing my arm against his fingers. It was a soft, innocent touch, but nothing about this was innocent anymore. The heat between us was undeniable, as if a spark had ignited something irreversible. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and desire. "We can't keep doing this." But his fingers found my chin, lifting it so I had no choice but to meet his gaze. "We already are," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion, "and I don't want it to stop." I closed my eyes, torn between the love I felt for my husband and the pull of this forbidden connection. I had no answers, no solutions. All I knew was that in that moment everything else disappeared. And then, as quickly as it had come, the moment vanished. A sudden knock at the door shattered the spell. My heart stopped. It was him, my husband. I instinctively pulled away, panic rising inside me as the doorbell rang again, louder this time. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I hide? Should I pretend nothing had happened? But he didn't move either. He just stood there watching me, his eyes filled with something unreadable. "Go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He hesitated for a moment longer before finally turning and leaving the kitchen. As the sound of his footsteps faded, my heart pounded in my chest, knowing time was against me. The doorbell rang again, followed by the jingle of keys as my husband entered the house. I could hear his footsteps echoing down the hallway, oblivious to the chaos I was struggling to contain within myself. I stood there, frozen, trying to steady my breathing, aware that the secret we both carried wouldn't stay hidden for long. I turned to the kitchen window, hoping to calm my nerves, but there was no escaping the weight of the situation. What was I doing? What was he doing? Every moment felt like a ticking time bomb. And the worst part was that I couldn't stop it. I heard my husband calling from the living room, his voice filled with casual cheer. "Sweetheart, I'm home. Where are you?" I swallowed hard. Where was he? My stepson had vanished after our brief encounter, and now I was left alone to deal with the fallout. "I'm in the kitchen," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. He walked into the kitchen a moment later, giving me a warm smile. "Hey," he said, his eyes scanning my face with a hint of concern. "Everything okay?" I nodded quickly, forcing a smile, though I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. "Yeah, just tired." He gave me a sympathetic look, probably assuming I was just stressed from work. He walked to the counter and poured himself a glass of water, unaware of the storm raging in my mind. But even as he stood there, everything inside me screamed to confess, to tell him the truth, to end this nightmare. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. And then, as if on cue, I heard a soft knock at the back door. I froze. Who could it be? I glanced at my husband, still drinking his water, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside. "I'll get it," I said quickly, my voice tight. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But when I opened it, my heart sank. There on the threshold stood my stepson, his face serious, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "You have to go," I whispered urgently, stepping onto the back porch to speak to him in private. He didn't move. He just stood there watching me, waiting for me to explain. But there was no way to explain what had almost happened. No way to explain the mess we were now tangled in. Please, I repeated, my voice shaking. You can't be here, not like this. His eyes softened, but there was something else in them. A spark of defiance, something deeper than I was ready to face. You can't push me away, he said quietly, his tone laden with an emotion I couldn't place. Whatever this is between us, it's not over. I stepped back, my heart racing. I couldn't do this. I shouldn't do this. But I couldn't deny the truth any longer. We have to stop, I said, my voice breaking. He reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was gentle, but it sent an electric jolt through me. I don't think we can, he whispered. And then it happened, the moment I'd been trying to avoid. The door behind me opened, and my husband stepped onto the porch looking confused. What's going on? He asked, his eyes darting between the two of us. In that instant, everything stopped. The truth was there, hanging in the air between us, but I didn't know how to say it, how to make him understand. And then I heard the sound of a car pulling up, the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. My heart sank as I realized it was too late. The storm had arrived,